In the second panel today, we'll be picking up where the last panel left off. Thank you, Austin and colleagues, for a great conversation about the experience of the Synod on Synodality and where we might go from here. And during this panel, we're going to come back to what's transpired in Rome, of course, over the past several months and years, not just in Rome, but around the world. We're also going to take a step back and adopt a wider lens to look at the broader historical context of the Synod on Synodality and the issues it raises for our understanding of the Church and where it's going, indeed, including issues of theology and how it can contribute to this wider conversation. For those of you who weren't here at the outset, my name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University, one of the sponsors of our conference today. And it's my pleasure to introduce two colleagues who will be leading the conversation. My job will be to keep things moving forward and also to allow time for a conversation with all of you. To my far right, my friend and colleague from Georgetown, Jose Casanova, a senior fellow at our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a leading expert on globalization, religions, and the secular. For many years, Jose taught in our Department of Sociology and also in our Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and before that, for many years at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Among his many publications, I'll single out a modern classic, Public Religions in the Modern World, published in 1994, since translated into many different languages, and mention just a couple of other more recent publications, a volume on the Jesuits and globalization that we co-edited together, and more recently, a volume with our Georgetown colleague Peter Fan on the Asian Pacific Catholicism and globalization. Jose's received many rewards and accolades over the years. I'll just mention one, the Theology Prize from the Salzburger Hochschulwochen, in recognition of his lifelong achievements in the field of theology, which is not bad for a sociologist, right?
Indeed.
Indeed.
It was a shock for me.
And then to my immediate right, Monsignor Thomas Halleck, who many of you know as a leading contemporary theologian and a prominent public intellectual, a professor of sociology at Charles University in Prague, pastor of its academic parish. He's also served as president of the Czech Christian Academy since 1990. Monsignor Halleck has found a path to faith in a radically secular society back in the day under communist rule, and has been a powerful intellectual and prophetic voice and presence in the Czech Republic and in Europe in the many years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Among his path-breaking books, I'll just mention two, Night of the Confessor, Christian Faith in an Age of Uncertainty, and most recently and highly recommended, The Afternoon of Christianity, The Courage to Change. Like Jose, Tomas has also received many awards and accolades, and I'll just single out here, very impressive, the 2014 Templeton Prize. Also very much worth noting, your work and your person were the subject of a conference at Cambridge just last week. How was that? Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, congratulations. That says a lot, and it's a great honor, and a great honor for you to be part of our conversation with us this afternoon. We're going to proceed much the same way we did at the first panel. We have some orienting questions that I will share, and then I'll ask Tomas and then Jose to share 8 to 10 minutes of preliminary remarks, responding to those questions as they see fit. I'll then lead a conversation here at the table among us, again, leaving plenty of time for conversation with you all. So the questions that many of you will have seen on the website that just serve as a point of departure. Any of you who've ever organized a conference or a panel know that's all what these questions can do. But I think they are important, and we will be addressing them in one way or another. First, what is the historical significance of the Synod? Second, how does it relate to other aspects of Francis's pontificate? And third, how can theological reflection illuminate the significance of the Synod for our understanding of the Church, its internal dynamics, and its relationship with the wider world? So with that, over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Tom, for this nice obituary. When I was when I was now in Cambridge, I said it would be better, more convenient for the people they are already dead. So I apologize. I am partly alive.
You could talk now.
Yeah. There was a great expectation of this synod in Rome, expectation of some radical changes in institutional changes in canonic law, and so some people are perhaps disappointed. But we should say what a synodality is. So the synod was perhaps a little more like the spiritual retreat to change the mentality. And it is the most important to change the mentality. So I was asked some years ago in Warsaw, what was Vatican II? Was it the end of Catholicism or the unfinished revolution? And I said it was both. In one sense, it was the beginning of the end of this Catholicism as a closed system, which was developed during the modernity as a contra culture against the modern culture, modern philosophy, modern science, and it was the first step of the exodus of the church from this Catholicism to the Catholicity, the universality, openness of the church, more sensitivity toward the senses, the signs of the times. And on the other hand, it was an unfinished revolution because we believe that it was the act of the Holy Spirit, or the acts of the Holy Spirit are unfinished, must go forward. The Synod is about the culture of communication and relations. Communication inside the church, but also outside the church's communication with the other churches, other religion, communication inside the church. It was the first task, the transformation of the clerical rigid system into a flexible network of relations between bishops and clergy and lay people, men and women in the church. But it is not enough. We need also the communication, not only, and the synodal communication, not only inside of the church, but also outside. Every system which is closed, degenerate, which is not able to communicate with the other system of society. And I think the Vatican II was the first step toward this communication with other churches, with other religions, but also with the people they are outside the visible boundaries of the Christian churches, especially the seekers. I think the number of these nuns, of the seekers, is increasing, and perhaps during the pandemic lockdown, when the churches were closed, I said it is not a prophetic sign. So many churches, seminaries, and monasteries are half empty or closed. It's a warning. It's a warning sign, and so we need to, and it was like, and then I remember the scene from the Gospel of Mark, the women's by the empty tomb, and we shouldn't cry on the empty tomb of some dying form of Christianity. We should not overhear the voice, "He is not here. He's risen. Go to Galilee, and then you can meet him." And the question is, where is the Galilee of today, when we can meet Christ in some new forms? So the Christ coming, the risen Christ coming back to his nearest and dearest. They were not able to recognize him. Mary Magdalene, she's a gardener, and Thomas recognized him after his wounds, which is very important sign to recognize Christ. I love this legend of Saint Martin. To Saint Martin, Christ has appeared in the form of devil, the Satan has appeared in him in the form of Christ, and he asked, "Where are your wounds?" And the devil has no wounds, and I don't believe in God without wounds, in Christ without wounds, in church without wounds, in the faith without wounds. So wounded Christ is the Christ is healing us through his wounds. The synodality is also the relic year of the Vatican II. The key word of Vatican II was dialogue, but perhaps we need now something more, something deeper than dialogue between the separated groups. Perhaps the key word for the synodality should be perichoresis. To realize that we are part of the one whole, and so the deeper consciousness that we belong together, and we must, in our plurality, to seek the compatibility. The important message of the Vatican II was the first sentence of Gaudium et Spes. The Church promised, it sounds like the marriage vows. The Church promised the modern humanity fidelity, love, and respect. But there was no reciprocity. So for the modern men, the church was a little bit too old bride, perhaps. And so I think we must now offer something more than just the great task of the Vatican II was some reconciliation with the modernity, with some values of enlightenment and so on. But we live now in quite a different era, in the postmodern radical global society. And we need also a great change in our theology, because the theology in the pre-modern time and the modern time served to religion in the sense of religare, to connect. The religion in the pre-modern time was the integrative force of the whole society. And the theology was queen of sciences and connected all the knowledge. But this time is over. But we can perhaps discover a new role of a religion from relegere to read again. to new hermeneutics, religion as a new way to read again, to read deeply, to read in the broader context, to read again the gospel, to read again our tradition, to read again the signs of the time. And I think it is a role of the synodality, this relecture, this new hermeneutics. We should take very seriously that the church is a sacrament of the unity of all people, of all humanity. But this perfect unity is an eschatological goal. We are not in this goal. We are not in the point omega. We are on the way. And the great temptation and which we should struggle is the triumphalism. Maybe for Pope Francis said we must overcome the clericalism. But I think clericalism is just one aspect of this triumphalism, and triumphalism is the mistake and heresy, is the idea that we are already the ecclesia triumphans, but we are not yet the ecclesia triumphans. We are the ecclesia militants, and we should fight and struggle, especially with this temptation of triumphalism, with this idea that we are already the perfect church and that we are the owners of the whole truth. Only Jesus can say, I am the truth. We are not Jesus, we are disciples of Jesus. And the truth is the book which no one of us read until the end. And so we must go together with other people to listen, to take seriously the experiences of the others, so to be the community of pilgrims. And this distinction between the perfect church and the church on earth, it's this eschatological difference. Heidegger spoke about the ontological difference, and I think we need this eschatological difference, and this is the negative eschatology, that which is the criticism against the secular eschatology, but also against this triumphalism. Yes, we need a deeper ecumenism. And what will be the next practical step? I was asked by many people, what will be the next step? And I wrote Pope Francis a letter, personal letter, with a proposal that perhaps the next step should be the ecumenical synod of theologians. There was a synod of parish priests, and I was there, the similar role as Timothy has in this synod in Rome, and but we need the Synod of Theologians. I was last week in Rome. There was a conference about the future of theology, which was in the synodal way, in the synodal method. It was very good. But we need also to invite the theologians from the other tradition. And just a few days ago, I spoke with Roman Williams and with Professor Ferguson in Cambridge, and I told them this idea. So yes, of course, we are prepared to do something like that. So I think it should be perhaps the next step. I like very much one metaphor of Pope Francis, church as a field hospital. So to go, I remember this wonderful preaching of Bergoglio day before he was elected, and he quoted the Apocalypse, Jesus stands by the door is knocking, but he said he's knocking from the other side. He want to go out, and we should follow him. He's going where the people are wounded, where are the marginalized, and so it is something similar, like the idea of Benedict, this courtyard of Gentiles. I was very pleased when I heard first time this idea of Benedict. He said it first time in the plane on his way to Prague. So he got always the best ideas in the plane. He was perhaps too near the boss, and it was a nice idea. So to create the place for the speakers, for the agnostics, and so on. But I think this time is over already. The church is no more like a temple of Jerusalem. So this temple form of the church was destroyed by many things, and the most visible were the scandals with abuse. But I think it was just the last drop. And this scandal, this abuse scandals played a very similar role, like the scandals with the indulgences in the Middle Age. It was also seen at first as some marginal phenomena, but then people like Luther realized this is a key for the deeper crisis of the whole church system, medieval church system. And I think these scandals, these abuse scandals, was something similar. It was also the sign there is something wrong with the whole system. And Pope Francis, yes, it is a system of clericalism, and we should change this. It's not enough to create a place for the agnostic. We must go out and create the church as a field hospital. But a field hospital needs also some background of the very solid hospital, and this solid hospital should provide another services like the diagnostic. It is the chirology, the diagnostic of the spiritual climate, and also to provide the system of immunity against so many spiritual diseases of our time. It is the populism, the new nationalism. They are the spiritual diseases of our time, and we should, and the church and the universities and the literature should provide some kind of the immunity system against this spiritual infections, and then also the rehabilitation. And it will be very important, especially after the period of wars, dictatorship. The societies are wounded, and they need the long process of reconciliation. So now is the war in Ukraine, in Gaza, and so, and the politicians are always looking for the moment, the stop of shutting bombing. Okay, but it is not the stop of the whole system. There will be the nations, the relations between those nations. It will be wounded for generations, and it needs the long process of reconciliation. And there is the great role of the church, is reconciliation. It doesn't happen in the post-communist countries. So I was so happy that our Velvet Revolution was so velvet, and there was no revanche and something bloody. Yeah, but it was a little bit too easy to say. I was dissident, you were confident, now everything is okay, now we will forget it. It's not so easy if the problems, if the wounds are just suppressed and not heard, there is something wrong in the whole system. So we need also this role of reconciliation. And who should be the expert for reconciliation if not the church? So I think there will be a lot of work on this. I've got another, but okay, perhaps we can.
We can come back to
later.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Lots of issues to come back to. Let's give him a round of applause. Jose. Yeah.
Well, we've heard fantastic reflections in the previous panel about the experience of the experiential knowledge that comes from participating in the Synod. And now we heard theological reflections, very deep theological reflections about ecclesiology, the church. My reflections are going to be more from a sociological, long-term historical perspective and from a global perspective of both the church and secular society. I'm going to begin with a very strong statement. It marks the historical significance, it marks the transition from a conciliar church to a synodal church, from what will be the model of conciliarism to a model of synodality. Now, this was a synod, and in this respect it was a council. Synod and council are the same word. So synod is the Greek word for council, council is the Latin word for synod. But they mean different things. Synod, etymologically, synodos, meaning walking with. And this is this dynamic element of the church movement, pilgrimage. Council, we associate with giving counsel to the authorities. All kinds of authorities have counselors, giving them, and also consultation, the authorities consulting the people. So these two aspects of the council are different from the synod. Now, all the first councils were synods, were Greek synods, basically from the Greek church. The first one really organized by the emperor, forcing all the bishops to come together. Give me the credo of the church. If you want me to be a Christian emperor, tell me what Christianity is. Give me the credo. So the Nicaea credo was the emperor that forced the bishops to come together and agree on a faith. Every council has been the way of defining the doctrines of the church and defining the boundaries of the church, who is in and who is out. And in this respect, they were both expressions of solidifying the identity of the church, but also excluding people from the church. Vatican II was the first council that did not define any dogma and did not exclude anybody. There was no anathema. Every other council had anathemas and definitions of dogmas. And this was the first council that did not. It was a pastoral council, and it was dedicated also to the global humanity. In this respect, it was the ultimate council, the truly first global ecumenical council of humanity, of a global Christian church. But you could say it was the passage to a new type of synod. This was the synod and synodality. It was a council to learn the church, to teach the church, or for the church to learn how to be a synodal church, so that the council is not an episodic event that basically is called to address a specific crisis and to respond to a specific crisis, but a way to learn the church how to become a synodal church. You could say how to become ecclesia semper reformanda, a church which is always reforming itself. But in all the reformations, the question has always been reforming from the head, from the body, the members. There has been always conflicts around the councils. Who needs reformation? The papacy, the bishops, the kings, the laity, the orders. And so there is a new way of being church. And the way is precisely to bring communication itself, internal communication, being the fundamental way of being church. And ethics of communication, the great modern philosopher Jürgen Habermas put communicative ethics as the form of precisely a modern, really dialogical society, not anymore reason as a monological, but a dialogical reason. You could argue that this way of being church is the attempt to institutionalize the very process of communicative action into a form of being church. So it's the most dramatic way in which not even secular societies. I remember when, and again, it's not the first time. I remember when I wrote in my book talking about the pastoral letters of the US bishops and the nuclear war and the economy, that those were the most important and so far institutionalization of communicative ethics in any institution in the world. More than there's no secular institution that had attempted that. And of course, precisely because the letters were written by the bishops after a long period of consultation in each parish, in each community, and then all of this was brought together into the consultation of the bishops with one another and with experts to write the letters. And so, of course, here what we have is now a process of reception on how we heard the big process of communication before the synod that went into the synod, then the communication internally within the synod that creates then a project that has to be disseminated and has to be received by the global church. So it's a process that then becomes, if you wish, ordinary process. Of course, there will be councils probably, but councils have the problem sometimes that they define a specific way of being church that excludes others. Or that defines, let's say, the Council of Trent was a great council that reformed the church radically, but then we didn't have any council for basically 300 years. We were afraid because we thought we already have the church as it ought to be. And no, there has to be, every council has reformed the church. And so there have been many reformed churches. And of course, the council that was a response to the Christian Reformation of the Reformed churches of Luther and Calvin was, of course, the one that then enclosed itself. The Catholicism was, of course, a response to Protestantism. And these isms, actually, the names themselves, were only came in the 19th century, not before. So the idea is we don't have really a definition of what is the church from within and that excludes the others, but we have a notion of a church which is the symbol of the unity of global humanity. If the Vatican II was the first truly ecumenical council of a global church, this is truly the first attempt to institutionalize this kind of communication at the different levels of the church. And so the church becomes a communion of communities. At each level, it should be not only the synod itself, is a council of communities representing all the different parts of the church, but then each community should be a community of communities. The Universal Church is a community of many local churches and of many regional churches, and the continental churches are themselves community of national churches. And then the national church is a community of diocesan churches, and the diocese is a community of parish churches, and the parish church itself should be a community of communities, because today the plurality is within each parish. It's not, so each parish has to be understood as a plurality of communities. And so we have to learn how to be a church. We can only be a really universal Catholic church if we incorporate the plurality of global humanity into the church. We call it enculturation, we call it incarnation. And we can only become a universal church if the church is incarnated in its culture, in its own local way, and then all these local narratives, understandings of the gospel somehow encounter each other and enter in communication with one another, and then we become truly a global Catholic church. Not Catholic with a big C, but Catholic with Catholicity that doesn't exclude anybody, but aspires to be a symbol of global humanity. This synodality is a sign, is a sacrament, if you wish, of how to be a universal global church. And then, of course, the question of how close this is to the project or the vision of this reforming Pope. A Pope that comes from the periphery, marched unto Rome, not to occupy the center and from there to legislate urbi et orbi, but actually comes to Rome, not occupy it, but doesn't enter into even the pontifical palace, but goes to Santa Marta, to the other place, and to open the church to the peripheries, to the plazas. So it doesn't come there to occupy and then from there, but precisely to open the church to the peripheries and to incorporate. And so this synodal council is a way of incorporating also the peripheries, those who were not part, they were not at the table. So this is basically something which is really, really, truly relevant. Of course, synodality itself has been part of religious orders, as somebody put out, has been part of the Eastern churches, but in different ways. I don't think that the model of synodality, the way it is now presented as a universal way of including everybody in the church, is something very, very new. Which leads us to the notion that this is the kind of council or synod that could only happen in our contemporary global age. Every age encounters the news of the gospel anew, the New Testament anew. And so each church is a new church. But then the question is, which one is the true Christian church? Is the church of the Greek fathers? Is the truly close to them? Or is the one of the Middle Ages, the one of the Benedictines and all the Reformed monarchs? Or is the one of the mendicant orders? Or then the others of the Renaissance? All of them are true Christian churches and different ways of understanding the gospel. And I think that this is what leads us to the notion of precisely a kind of a narrative that can only be truly a global narrative for everybody. Let's say a narrative about the son of a carpenter in Bethlehem can only be a narrative that makes sense to everybody if it is not about this, but it's about incarnation, and these news then become incarnated in its culture. When we did the study of the Jesuits and globalization, what became interesting about the whole question of the Chinese rights controversy and the Malabar rights controversy, that what the Jesuits understood was that the church, which originally was Hebrew church or an Aramaic church, then became actually two, a Latin church and a Greek church. And both of them are equally the universal church of Christ. And the idea was, if the church, the gospel, could only become Latin and Greek by creating different Latin and Greek churches, maybe the story is we need not to Europeanize. So the mission is not to Europeanize, because Christianity is not a European doctrine, but we need the gospel to become Chinese and in Sanskrit and in every language and in every culture. And I think that this is precisely also what this process of synodality in our contemporary global world entails. And there's a paradox to this reforming papacy, a papacy that begins from the reform of the papacy from above. Before he, you could say, prepared this project of synodality, he had started the process of reformation, the Bishop of Rome, reforming the idea of the papacy itself, and being in synodality with all the bishops, but not only the Catholic bishops, but also with bishops of other Christian churches. And this idea, I think, is crucial. In the same way, the paradox of precisely a communicative church open to encounter and to accept the plurality within, at a moment in which the secular world has basically forgotten how to listen and how to communicate. And we have, in an age of polarization, in which secular politics has stopped really being based on dialogue and is based on basically yelling at each other, and social media, which are not anymore means of communication, but means of I don't know what, because there is no communication. Yeah, there is communication, but there are one-sided communication. There is not really dialogue there. That the church could become a symbol of what is possible at a time when people thought is religion what is the problem that brings war. Well, actually, today, it is this papacy that gives the symbol of encounter with other religions, with Muslims, goes to Asia and proclaims that it is the will of God. There are many religions. A pluribus unum. Sometimes we think that it means we should stop being plural just to become one. No, we have to be unity in plurality. We have to accept the plurality of Catholic churches, and I'm doing it of Catholic local churches, and the plurality of Christianities, and the plurality of Abrahamic traditions, and the plurality of religions which are part of the Holy Spirit, the spirit of creation, somehow within our global humanity. Then the church can become a sacrament of the unity of humanity that we all want to be. And so it's the beginning of a process, but it's a symbolic process. And I don't want to emphasize, it's not a break. All of it has been there from the very beginning, but it's now possibly can be expressed and understood in a way in our global age that could not be expressed before and that could not become institutionalized before. So I think that in this respect, it's up to us to decide how much we accept this call to become a synodal church which is a church for encounter, dialogue, healing, and reconciliation indeed. And well, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose, for those rich reflections. I've realized I may only have time for one question. So I've given it some thought, and I want to try to tie together the earlier panel and the incredible reflections you've just offered. It feels like, and we'll see how we look back on this moment 5, 10, 20 years from now, it feels like this is a historic moment. If we think back to our panel earlier this afternoon, where we had colleagues and friends, witnesses, participants in the Synod itself, talking about that experience over several years, it feels like a lot has been accomplished. Yes, a process has been started, but perhaps a cultural shift, is taking place at the level of the global church in the direction of participation, consultation, transparency, communion. I mean, that's very exciting. We couldn't have hoped for that necessarily 5 years ago before this process had gotten going, especially at the depths of the pandemic. So if this is a historic turning point, and both of you seem to also acknowledge that possibility. So if this is a historic turning point, my question for you both is, how did we get here? And I think there's an uplifting narrative, but also a more pessimistic narrative. The uplifting narrative might be, this is the logic of Vatican II, being played out finally 60 years later. An optimistic narrative might be, this is the vision of Pope Francis, shaped through his experience in the global South. And we heard about the Amazon Synod as an example of this idea of participation, consultation, and so on. There are various optimistic causes one can point to, factors one can isolate. But we could also see this as a response to deep divisions in the church that have emerged, that have almost brought the church to a breaking point. I'm being a little bit dramatic here, but divisions caused by the clerical abuse scandal, divisions undermining the legitimacy of the church, the loss of confidence of young people, especially in Europe and the United States, divisions around questions of gender and sexuality, divisions between the burgeoning church and the global South around some of those issues and other issues. Was there really any alternative to opening up the church and trying to create a more decentralized structure to accommodate these deep divisions that have threatened the unity and the flourishing of the church? So that would be a more pessimistic view of the moment we're going through, which might suggest that while it's a historic moment, there's lots of reasons for hope. These processes, and here's what a conservative might argue, are actually fomenting and bringing out more and more divisions that will be harder to deal with in the years to come. So what do you think about how we got here, the historical causes, the more positive and maybe the more pessimistic narrative of where we are in this historical process?
So the life is always change, evolution, but there are some moments of the change of paradigm. And I think we live in such a moment, and in such a moment, the evolution, the changes are so rapid, and the psychological reaction is the disorientation, anxiety, and anxiety about the identity. People need the identity, but we should say that the tradition the church is the process of mutual recontextualization, and the tradition is something dynamic, and the identity of the church and Christianity is not just in the institutional form. The identity, the real core of Christianity is the continuing process of resurrection. I think this Easter event is the key to understand what is happening in Christianity. The Christianity is the continuation, is the incarnatio continua, is always Jesus is coming, and this the Advent, and our mission, our evangelization is part of this incarnation, but it must be always connected with the inculturation. Evangelization without inculturation is just the indoctrination. So we need in this inner dialogue with the culture. But there is also this tragic moment. There's also this passio continua, and there will be always in the history of the church some dark nights. But these dark nights are always also the challenge. They are also the possibility for maturity. There are the individual dark nights, and there are the collective dark nights in the history of church, in the history of humanity. But we have in the teaching of the mystics very good impulses how to behave in such a moment, which are the natural part of our journey. And there is this resurrectio continua, and this is the church, the living Christ, which is sometimes hidden, which is sometimes coming in anonymity. So the history after the resurrection is already, in a certain sense, the second coming. Jesus is coming to us in many forms, and our Christian existence is the adventure to discover Him also in very surprising form. So I think we should see that this identity is something dynamic, because people want the identity, but sometimes in the identitarian religion is the very dangerous religion. So the identity is something dynamic in evolution.
Thank you.
You are right. You are right in the sense that divided, internally divided Catholic Church, very much so, we have to accept it, is an outcome of the different narratives about what Vatican II meant. And as I said, was the first council that didn't define doctrine, and the problem with definition of doctrine is always the doctrine against somebody and excluding then the others. And we know how the Council of Trent led to the permanent then split between the Reformation churches and the Catholic Church. And you had the schism with the East before, with some councils already brought. And so a council that would have defined any doctrine as the doctrine of the church would have led to a fundamental crisis within the church, probably to schisms, and especially within the church. This was also, of course, the spirit of the prior synod and the family. Pope Francis, the first Pope that was not a bishop at Vatican II, that understands the multiplicity of narratives over Vatican II, that wasn't want to impose one of them, that in Aparecida especially, you have the understanding of a church which is a very plural church and that incorporates different forms of being Catholic. And this is something that, as he says, he wants to open up a process. He doesn't want to decide. He understands that in our global church, it cannot be legislated from Rome anymore and uniformly for all of the church. So, and then of course, he makes the distinction between the things which are non-negotiable, the true core of our gospel. The gospel is the truly non-negotiable. And then the others, which are disciplinary understandings of the church, which are linked to a specific historical context. And these can be both reform, but also can be simultaneously, the same way you had both an authentic Greek Catholic church before schism, an authentic Latin Catholic church. Both of them were equally Catholic before the schism. You would have many, many different local Catholic churches which have many different disciplinary forms, as long as they are in communion with the Bishop of Rome. So, of course, the question is, how do we create structures in which you can have both plurality in communion? And so this is not union, but communion. So again, in the end, for any council that is only a council about defining the Catholic Church will be totally irrelevant for other Christian churches. So we don't need any more of these councils that define us, the Catholic Church, against other Christianities or other religions. We need precisely how to maintain the sacramental image of a very internally plural church, and how can we learn to live together and recognize each other, and that each of us somehow has a different relation to the gospel because we come from different countries, we come from different cultures, different histories. And so this is crucial, and I think that this Pope understands. That's why he calls himself the Bishop of Rome and doesn't want to legislate, open up a process. And of course, what makes this possible, this is what the difference between a secular legislation and, of course, you trust that somehow the Holy Spirit will guide the experience in the process. Without it, unless you believe that this is part of the way in which the Spirit works through these processes, then of course it leads to disaster. It leads to absolute, almost you could say, what they call nihilism and relativism, plural churches, plural understanding. No. So the question is how to maintain, but we can only do it if we understand how plural the Catholic tradition is historically. We must understand the very, very rich plurality within the Catholic Church going through the centuries, and not look into this church is the true church or this church is the true church. And only then can we accept the plurality within. And only when we have plurality within our own church can we accept the plurality outside of the church as well. So, because it's not us versus them, but it's our very different communities within our own communion that can enter in communion with other communities without union. And I think that this is how we can learn to be this type of church. This, of course,
the ethics of mutual respect. That is very important.
In the language of pluralism, not division, and dependence on the Spirit, which again was the theme in our earlier.
Plurality, not diversity, because diversity things that diverse, and I don't like the language of diversity. I like the language of plurality.
Okay.
And
Wonderful. Well, we do have some time for questions from you all. We'll have a roving mic. I'd ask you to stand up, briefly introduce yourself, and pose a brief question. Dominic. Yeah.
It's primarily, I'm Dominic White Pryor here. It's primarily a question, I think, for Professor Casanova. Very interested in this idea of plurality, and certainly from some of the informal ecumenical conversations I've had with Anglicans and Orthodox Christians who can see the value of the Petrine charism, doctrinal unity that it brings,
Right.
would like to come into full communion, but find it difficult to trust the Catholic Church that their distinct charisms will actually be respected and enabled. So I agree with you on that. My question is, I'm not so sure about the e pluribus unum with regard to other religions. I mean, are we saying that if we can get our own house in order, actually we'll get on really well with the Jews and the Muslims and the Hindus, and they don't need to become Christian? Because actually we've learned how to do diversity at last. It's all been our fault, really. Or are we saying that actually we've created conditions where they might be baptized but retain much of their character? There could be something like, for example, a Jewish ordinariate, some distinct structures for Muslims that might respect Sufi spirituality. But I would find it difficult to reconcile with Catholic teaching the idea that we have, as it were, an unreconciled plurality, unless we say that all religions are just a source of salvation and we have a kind of universalism, a bit like a la John Hick. What would your response be to that?
Well,
thank you.
I mean, my experience comes from having studied experience of the Jesuits in Asia, which of course is a very problematic experience. As you know, it led to a lot of conflicts with Dominicans and with Franciscans that thought that the Jesuits were compromising too much the universality of Christianity for this inculturation, accommodation to other cultures. But the richest response came, look, the people, I want to tell them that this is the universal truth. They will ask me, how can you tell me that this story you tell you, which is relevant for you about this carpenter in Nazareth, is relevant for all my ancestors who never heard of it? Does it mean they are all in hell? And of course, for a Chinese to think that their parents are in hell is the worst possible form of hell. And so it was out of this notion that he understood, and he tells very clearly, that we incorporated Saint Cicero and Saint Seneca and so much of the ancient classics into the Catholic Church, and we've made it into the core of the philosophy that we teach before theology. Then I think, for him, he says, Confucius was closer to the natural theology before the gospel, almost like the closest to revelation of natural law, much closer than the ancient classics we accept as a form of natural law. So the idea here, again, we are entering into only if we think of the spirit of creation. So it's not only if we think theologically in Trinitarian terms. So the question is not Dominus Jesu, yes. So it's the unique revelation of Jesus, but in Trinity, and the spirit of creation has been there in every culture of the world. Only if we believe in that, then our story, our narrative is a truly universal human story. If not, it's not. If not, it's a story of conversion, of everybody becoming like us. And it's a very problematic story today. In our global age, to think that the whole world or that the universality of Christianity comes from their accepting that this is the only revelation of God or of the spirit of creation. The spirit of Pentecost and the spirit of creation are the same spirit. And the fact that the people spoke in languages, in many languages, in many cultures. This is again, it's a mystery, and I'm not talking about simply Hicks and the kind of universalism, all religions are the same. No, on the contrary. I think that it's very important to maintain the authenticity, the uniqueness of each tradition being part of a mystery of revelation that we don't understand yet, but that we try to understand. And in this process, we encounter the other in this as to the kind of relations we are going to have with each other non-Christian religion. It will be very different. The relation with Judaism is going to be very different with the relation with Islam, the relation with Asian traditions which are not monotheistic. Obviously, this is very clear. But there are, I think, in the 20th century, a lot of examples of, if you wish, Catholic monks, Buddhist Catholic monks, if you wish, or Catholic Buddhism, or Buddhist Catholicism, the same way there is a Christian Confucianism and a Confucian Christianity. And of course, today, for a while, for centuries, we thought it was possible then, and it's to become possible again. And it's only again, I'm not a theologian, so I'm sorry if anybody thinks that I'm here speaking out of, but this is the way in which I see the Spirit moving, and I hope that this is where we are heading.
So every Christian is an interpreter of the gospel, interpreter of Christ, and this interpretation in the new context and the new culture context is always the great chance to discover something new from this plenitude and from this richness of Jesus Christ. We see this originality of the saints. Saint Francis of Assisi, it was so original interpretation of the gospel, and it was always something what was forgotten at a certain age. The value of poverty, and there must come somebody who discovered this and put it into the context. So I was also, for me, it was a great experience when I met the Father Kadowaki, the Japanese Jesuit, who wrote a wonderful book, Zen and Bible, and he said the Japanese thinking is much more near to the Hebrew thinking than the Greek thinking, and Jesus' parables are koans, are riddles. It opened me absolutely new perspective. So I think we have many things to discover.
Thank you. Further questions over here?
Thank you both. The vows that spouses make to one another are vows of love. And for that love to be redemptive and fruitful, certain things must necessarily be excluded. The same could be said for the vows of consecrated life or the promises priests make. To be able to love faithfully requires that we accept certain things are excluded. Why is it wrong for the Church to exclude certain things which she judges to prevent her from loving fully, be it harmful doctrines, ideologies, or persons?
These were the signs of the times, the discernment, which parts of the signs of the times are the ones that we must accept, and which ones are the ones we must reject. It's, of course, the work. It is a work of discernment, and which aspects of secular society are there from which we can learn, and which other, let's put it, the question of gender. As a sociologist, I can guarantee you that this is the most radical and most rapid moral revolution in the history of humanity. And it's going to take, I mean, let's be honest. 50 years ago, or certainly 70 years ago, not only all the churches, but all the judges and the doctors and the teachers, everybody thought the homosexuality or same-sex love is a pathology. It was declared a pathology by everybody. Today, when I talk to my children's generation, they think what is immoral for them is the people that declare this love for one another. If it's truly a love which is the love, exactly those who do not accept it as a form of human dignity, a form of dignity. And so the young people are scandalized, not by this form of love, but by people that don't accept that this type of love may be also a form of Christian love in the same way that the love. You may say, okay, but this is not written so in the Bible. I understand. There are many things in the Bible that are not written like that. And I'm not going to say that we must accept that a lot of things about the gender revolution, the sexual revolution, which are to be discarded, which is precisely the objectification of women, the kind of objectification of all kinds of relationships. But in the same way, there was a time, I grew up in the Franco regime, and when we thought that there was a specific third way of Catholicism between liberal bourgeois Protestant democratic societies and communist socialists. It is a Catholic way, a Catholic economy, a Catholic state, a Catholic family. We understand that no, it's only when the bishops in the US declared that the economy is not more Catholic, the more Catholic will be, the more Christian, the one that respect most the dignity of the human person. So if we put the dignity of the human person as the criteria for any kind of morality, political, economic, also sexual. So the kind of relations which enhance the dignity of everybody involved in the relationship are to be accepted. Those which somehow do not enhance the dignity of these persons are to be rejected and excluded. So there is a way of finding a universal morality. But we must, I think that if we are going to call ourselves Catholic, we have to accept the multiplicity of Catholic churches through history. And the fact that, okay, I'm going to say Franciscans and Dominicans, you were at war with one another for several centuries, and then came the Jesuits, you hated the Jesuits, and so these things, and today, of course, you all work so lovely with one another, and we understand. And yes, you understand what makes the religious community so unique today is that they are really communities, that they have to live together as brothers and sisters, although they may think very differently. So you have a lot of pluralism within the religious communities living together, but respecting each other as brothers and sisters. And so this is the lesson we have to do to take. And unlike clericalism, I'm sorry, in this respect, the religious communities are not clericalism, precisely in a different way. Clericalism is the problem, I would argue. But anyhow.
We have time for one or two more questions. There's one right here. Yeah, please. Mike is coming.
Thank you, Jonathan Luxmore, a journalist. I listened to this particularly addressed to Father Tomasz. I listened to what you said. It sounds very attractive. You are a master of sound bites. There's no question about that. But I wonder, those of us who come from a non-Catholic background, who have had the very painful experience of what happens when their churches open up to the world and open up to ecumenism in the wrong kind of way. I simply, I have to express a great deal of skepticism about the kind of vision of synodality, which, as I understand it, you seem to be presenting. But because I have to ask you a question, could I ask you if the Pope did agree to your synod of theologians from all, what would be the function of this synod? What would it achieve, which would somehow enhance the synodality now being practiced in the Catholic Church? Thank you.
I think the first task of this Synod of Theology and Ecumenical should be to discover this sign of the times, and then to try for the right answers to this sign of the times. So this diagnostic of our the spiritual diagnostic of our age. And I think the other churches perhaps have the possibility to see this from another perspective. So we should enrich and enlarge our perspective. And so without this, I cannot imagine my theology without Tillich, Bonhoeffer, and so on, and also some Orthodox. And we must to put it together. I was from yesterday, a very nice experience. I was in London, invited by one Polish community, and the Polish community have their home in the Anglican church. It's a nice Anglican church, and the Anglican community is very welcoming. So they are doing so many things together, and I celebrated this Polish Catholic Mass, and I've got a sermon in this Anglican Mass, and then I went to the tabernacle, and they were two Eucharists. There was besides there was the Anglican Jesus, and then was the Catholic Jesus in the same tabernacle. But so I said, and I said, there is something schizophrenic. They do everything together, and they have everything, but they have two Lord Jesus side by side.
Well, thank you. We are going to end a little bit early because we want to leave a little time to stretch our legs and also set up for the keynote. So do not go very far. We're going to start right at 5 o'clock. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking both our speakers.